The hospital hums with quiet night rhythms. Monitors beep steadily. A lone night nurse moves through the dim corridor, pushing a supply cart with careful, deliberate steps. Surgeons glance at her, shaking their heads, dismissive. She's just the night nurse. A sudden alarm pierces the calm. A patient's vitals spike, red lights flare. Staff freeze, chaos building. Through the glass of the isolation bay, figures move fast, coordinated, dangerous. The nurse stops, eyes narrowing, hands tightening on the cart. She doesn't run, she doesn't panic. A faint crackle of the radio echoes in the hallway. Evac helicopter requesting clearance. The room goes still. Everyone looks at her. And in that pause, in that weightless moment, it becomes clear they were wrong about her. The night had settled over St. Vincent's Hospital with the quiet patience of routine. Fluorescent lights hummed softly above corridors lined with pale blue walls and polished floors. The faint beep of heart monitors provided a steady rhythm, almost hypnotic, a soundtrack to calm and order. The night nurse moved through the ward with deliberate care. Her scrubs were ordinary pale blue, slightly rumpled from the long shift ahead, her ID badge swinging lightly with each step. She wheeled a linen cart down the hallway, pausing briefly at each room to check IV lines, straighten blankets, and adjust monitors. Every motion was precise, economical, a small choreography of competence unnoticed by the world around her. In the nurse's station, two surgeons huddled over charts, glancing at her without really seeing. One shook his head subtly, a faint smirk of dismissal tugging at his lips. "She's just the night nurse," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. They didn't acknowledge her presence, and she didn't seek it. Her eyes flicked past them calmly, noting minor irregularities. A bed slightly too high, a monitor not calibrated exactly, but she said nothing. The patients slept, oblivious to the quiet scrutiny of the woman moving among them. A faint groan from room 12 drew her attention, and she moved over with careful efficiency. A minor oxygen fluctuation, easily corrected. She adjusted the flow, replaced a loose tube, and moved on. Not a word of alarm, no rush. Yet beneath the calm exterior, something always watched. The nurse's eyes scanned, measured, catalogued. Hallway doors, stairwell access points, security cameras. Nothing out of the ordinary, yet her posture, the tilt of her head, suggested that she expected it, that she was prepared, not for the hospital, not for the charts or the machines, but for the unforeseen. A beep sounded from the isolation bay at the far end of the corridor. The nurse's gaze flicked toward it, subtle and fast. Another staff member would have ignored it as a routine alert. She didn't, not fully. Her hand rested lightly on the cart, fingers curling just enough to anchor herself, ready if needed. Time moved slowly at night. The hospital felt suspended between normality and possibility. Staff walked corridors with casual confidence, but she carried something heavier: awareness, preparation, restraint, quiet authority without announcement. And as she adjusted the IV line in room 7, checking the vitals on a frail patient, she sensed a shift. A subtle tension in the hallway, a faint, unaccountable hum in the air, too precise to be accidental. She didn't look alarmed. She didn't need to. She simply noted it, positioned herself near the supply cart, and continued her rounds with the calm precision of someone who knew that tonight, what others dismissed could become urgent. Her steps echoed softly on the polished floor, unnoticed by the surgeons and staff, unremarkable to anyone who might have passed her. But in the stillness, in the small decisions she made, the careful positioning, the subtle observation, the quiet competence, she held the ward, not in the way anyone expected. And for the first time that night, the distant hum of the monitors and the soft light of the hallway carried more than routine, they carried potential. The quiet rhythm of the night had not lasted long. As the nurse moved down the far corridor, she noticed the subtle anomalies before anyone else. A stairwell door, normally locked, hung slightly ajar. She paused, glancing at it without drawing attention, eyes narrowing for just a fraction of a second. No one else noticed. No one else would have. A nurse hurried past, wheeling a gurney, murmuring apologies. The night nurse's hand rested lightly on her cart, her posture unchanged, yet every muscle seemed to register the shift. She knew the building, every corner, every exit, every vulnerable angle. In that instant, her awareness expanded beyond routine patient care. She began cataloging vulnerabilities as if anticipating the storm before it arrived. At the nurse's station, she passed a clipboard left unattended. Something about the paperwork felt off, not its contents, but its placement. A small thing, easily dismissed, yet her instincts ticked quietly in the background. A missing pen, an unlocked drawer, the faint scent of cleaning solvent masking another, more deliberate presence. Down the hall in the isolation bay, monitors flickered briefly, too briefly for the alert system to catch. A patient moved slightly in his sleep, yet his vitals showed an irregular spike. The nurse stepped closer, adjusting the settings with quiet precision. The anomaly corrected itself, but her mind cataloged the event, a note filed for later, potential stress indicator. From the supply room, a faint sound came, metallic, deliberate. She paused mid-step, listening. No footsteps on the polished floor, no voices, just the faint click of a lock or latch somewhere beyond sight. Her heart did not race, her breathing remained controlled. Awareness, not alarm. The staff around her remained oblivious. Surgeons discussed case notes with casual authority. Nurses shuffled between rooms. Patients slept. The night nurse moved among them, appearing ordinary, routine, almost invisible. Yet the tilt of her head, the measured pace, the precise observation told a different story. She was already responding, preparing the ward without raising suspicion, arranging her mental map of the environment, her awareness extending into corners no one else cared to check. By the time she reached the end of the corridor, a low, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the walls, mechanical, electrical, or something else. She didn't panic, she didn't announce it. Instead, she slowed, adjusting the cart slightly to position herself closer to the center of the ward. From here, she could move quickly to any point if needed, her presence calm, deliberate, and unobtrusive. The early unease lingered like a shadow, stretching along the hallway, unnoticed by everyone except the nurse. She sensed the ward's vulnerability, but she also sensed her own readiness. Tonight, what others dismissed could escalate, and she was already quietly, methodically preparing. No one questioned her, no one stopped her. They continued to underestimate her, and that mistake she knew would become theirs. The first real sign of danger arrived not with sirens or shouting, but with movement. Through the half-lit corridor, the nurse noticed figures she didn't recognize, civilian clothing, hurried steps, glances that darted too quickly. They weren't patients, staff, or visitors. Her eyes followed their path, noting how they avoided cameras and doors with unnatural precision. Her hand drifted toward the linen cart as she passed a patient room, not for defense, at least not yet, but as a positional anchor. Every muscle tensed subtly, her body ready to respond at the smallest signal. The intruder's approach was deliberate, yet disorganized in ways only a trained eye could detect. Timing, posture, their hesitation near doors, all told her everything she needed to know. A nurse shouted from down the hall, startled, as a door banged open. The figures froze, glancing toward the voice, then adjusted their course. The night nurse stepped forward, positioning herself between them and the nearest patient room, silently blocking their access. No one noticed the decisiveness of her movement, no one but the intruders. Her eyes scanned the ward. Isolation bay doors, emergency exits, supply closets. She mapped everything in her mind, where patients could be protected, where obstacles could slow intruders, where a single locked door could save lives. Her presence anchored the space. Staff glanced at her, momentarily uncertain at her calm authority, but did not question her. A sudden shout echoed from the far end of the corridor. One of the intruders had been spotted by a junior nurse. Panic flickered in their eyes, but they restrained themselves. The night nurse, without a word, stepped into the line of sight, blocking the path, her hands lightly resting on the cart. Her posture was relaxed but authoritative. The intruders had expected hesitation, and they found none. The hospital's alarm system began to hum as a routine breach sensor was triggered. The intruders froze. The nurse's eyes did not leave them. She did not move closer, did not speak, but every inch of her body radiated control. In that moment, she was both ordinary nurse and something else entirely. They had not accounted for her. A patient groaned softly from room 14. The nurse checked the vitals without breaking her stance, adjusting the IV line in one hand while her other remained on the cart. efficiency and calm in the middle of rising tension, something the intruders could not measure but could feel. The figures glanced at each other, hesitation creeping into their calculated movements. They were professionals in their own right, but she was already ahead. Every route they considered, every doorway they eyed had been accounted for, and yet she did not act overtly. She waited poised, letting the weight of her presence slow their momentum. The first confrontation was only moments away. She knew it. And when it came, they would discover what they had dismissed for so long. The night nurse was not just a caretaker. She was the authority they had underestimated, and the ward was already under her control. The intruders moved as if testing the ward, their steps deliberate, quiet, yet aggressive. They approached the far end of the corridor where patients slept unaware. The night nurse's eyes followed every movement, cataloging their posture, the weight of their steps, the subtle tension in their shoulders. Her hands rested lightly on the linen cart, fingers curling around the handle, ready to use it not as a weapon but as leverage, a barrier, a point of control. The first intruder glanced at her with a smirk, assuming hesitation. He stepped forward, casually swinging a hand toward the nearest doorway. She did not flinch. She did not speak. Instead, she adjusted the cart slightly, shifting its angle between him and the patient room. Her stance was calm, precise, economical, a silent signal that the space was controlled, that she was aware, and that any misstep would be noticed. A nurse in the mid-corridor gasped and took a step back, bumping into the handrail. One intruder froze mid-stride. The night nurse did not need to yell or threaten. Her presence alone altered the dynamics. She moved closer to the cart, tilting her body just enough to project authority without aggression. The intruders had underestimated her calm. That was their first mistake. One of the intruders lunged toward the cart, testing her response. She shifted weight, pivoted slightly, and blocked the path without touching him. The maneuver was almost imperceptible to anyone untrained, a small shift in leverage, a redirection of momentum, but to the intruder, it was immediate, undeniable. He stumbled barely, but enough to realize the nurse was not ordinary. Another intruder moved toward a patient bed, attempting to corral attention. She intercepted silently, adjusting the IV line and pressing a subtle control on the monitor that locked the bed's position electronically. Small, precise actions, unnoticed by staff and intruders alike, yet critical. She moved with restraint, containing the threat without confrontation escalating into chaos. Her eyes never left the intruders. She assessed, calculated, anticipated. A glint of panic appeared in one man's eyes. He had expected fear, hesitation, distraction. Instead, they found quiet competence. The ward under her influence had become an obstacle, a space carefully defended without a single shout. A monitor alarm sounded, triggered by the movement of an intruder brushing against a sensitive piece of equipment. Staff reacted, but the nurse's voice, calm and measured, instructed them where to guide patients. No panic. No overreaction. Efficiency and control radiated from her. The intruders were caught off guard, realizing their initial assessment of the ward and of her was flawed. The first confrontation ended not with violence but with a pause. The intruders froze, reassessing. The nurse did not step back. She did not advance. She simply stood, hands on the cart, body aligned, eyes sharp and calm. Her restraint was her weapon. Her quiet authority reshaped the corridor. And the intruders understood in that moment that this shift nurse was not to be ignored. The ward had settled into a fragile standoff. The intruders hesitated, measuring the nurse's calm, realizing the first impression of easy compliance had been a miscalculation. She did not move hastily. She moved deliberately. The night nurse shifted the linen cart slightly, aligning it with the corridor's exit points, creating a subtle blockade that could slow intruder movement without drawing attention. With one hand, she adjusted the lighting panel to dim certain sections, casting elongated shadows across the floor, shadows she knew would obscure motion and give her tactical advantage. Every action was invisible to the untrained eye, but every movement had purpose. She walked past a supply closet and quietly retrieved a few items: clamps, emergency sheets, and a portable monitor. Nothing looked unusual to anyone else, yet each item was positioned strategically, tools she could use to secure patients, slow intruders, or signal for help. Her mind ran through the ward's floor plan with precise clarity, noting every door, window, and camera angle. The staff around her moved hesitantly, glancing at her for guidance. She gave no orders. She simply adjusted their positioning with subtle gestures. A nurse wheeling a patient paused where she indicated. Another doctor bent low by a bed at her slight nod. She orchestrated the ward without announcing authority, her competence silent but commanding. A faint sound from the stairwell drew her attention. One intruder had tested an emergency exit, trying to flank the ward. Without rushing, she shifted her stance near the corridor junction, subtly directing the man's path through a combination of positioning and the threat of blocked exits. He hesitated, realizing the night nurse was anticipating his moves. She paused briefly at the nurse's station, tapping a sequence on the intercom panel. Her voice did not carry yet, but a faint code transmitted quietly through hospital channels. Someone, somewhere listening for this frequency, would respond, her connection to a higher authority now subtly in play. No one in the room noticed, but the intruders sensed the presence of unseen control. As she moved toward the isolation bay, she caught a glimmer of panic on one intruder's face, a tiny break in confidence. The nurse did not exploit it overtly. She adjusted a monitor, redirected a staff member, and subtly locked a door electronically. Her actions slowed the intruder's momentum, contained the space, and kept patients safe, all without raising her voice or exposing her full capability. By the end of this tactical shift, the ward had transformed. What once seemed ordinary, the night nurse, the hallways, the beds, had become a controlled environment, carefully managed by someone whose competence far exceeded expectation. The intruders had begun to realize that underestimation was now dangerous, and the night nurse remained calm, poised, and unrecognized. The intruders had adjusted to her presence, but the night nurse's calm control only invited their testing. Their movements became bolder, more aggressive, probing weak points in the ward's defenses. One moved toward the isolation bay, another toward the supply room, and a third lingered near the corridor junction, eyes scanning for the slightest gap. The nurse observed them all at once, her attention precise yet effortless. She did not shout, she did not panic. Every step, every glance was calculated, her body aligned for immediate response if required. Her hands hovered near objects that could be used strategically: a cart, a rolling tray, the edges of door frames, ready to redirect, contain, or block. She maintained control of the patient's safety first, using subtle adjustments, moving beds slightly, redirecting staff, monitoring vitals. Each action slowed the intruders without escalating confrontation. A loud crash shattered a monitor screen in one corner as one intruder tried to force a locked door. Staff froze, unsure what to do. The nurse moved calmly, her posture steady. Without words, she signaled a nurse to guide patients to safer areas, using gentle hand gestures. She intercepted the intruder's path, forcing him to pivot away from patients. The man froze, realizing the ward itself had become a barrier he could not overcome. The intruders exchanged hurried glances, frustration creeping into their movements. They had expected hesitation, disorder, fear. They found none. The nurse anticipated their patterns, predicting their next moves with an almost preternatural clarity, born not of fantasy but of disciplined experience. Every door they tried, every angle they approached had been accounted for. A faint alarm from the stairwell indicated another potential flanking maneuver. The nurse paused briefly, checking the path, and redirected the intruders with a subtle shift of her body and the cart. Their momentum faltered. One intruder's hand brushed against a medical cart she had strategically left in the corridor. He stopped, unsure whether to push forward or retreat. The escalation intensified when one intruder attempted to corner a staff member. The nurse moved between them, calm and composed. Her hand rested on the staff member's shoulder, guiding them back toward safety. No heroics, no shouting, just quiet authority, the weight of which pressed on the intruder without a single raised voice. By the time the intruders regrouped, the night nurse had already re-established the ward's order. Patients were safe, staff were calm enough to follow subtle direction, and the intruders' confidence had begun to crack. The balance of power had shifted quietly, imperceptibly, yet decisively. The night nurse's restraint had become her weapon. Her silence, her planning, and her quiet movements now dictated the pace of the conflict. For the first time, the intruders realized this was not an ordinary hospital worker. They had miscalculated entirely, and the ward had already changed because of her. The corridor hummed with tense anticipation. The intruders were no longer testing her, they were recalculating. Their movements slowed, each step measured against an unseen metric they could neither see nor understand. The night nurse remained calm, her hands lightly resting on the linen cart, eyes scanning every angle, posture aligned for control rather than confrontation. Then a faint crackle came from the intercom panel above the nurse's station. The Evac helicopter was on approach. Its voice carried through the hospital channels, requesting clearance for landing and patient extraction. All heads turned instinctively toward the source of authority, the night nurse, whose hands had barely moved, whose presence had quietly commanded the ward this entire time. She picked up the handset with steady fingers, her voice low but precise. "Clearance granted, all patients secured. Maintain approach protocol," she said. There was no fanfare, no dramatics, just quiet, undeniable authority. Her words carried weight beyond the scrubs she wore, beyond the routine night shift. The intruders froze mid-step, uncertainty flashing across their faces. A subtle shift occurred among the hospital staff. They glanced at her now with hesitation, the first hints of realization breaking through their previous dismissal. The surgeons, who had shrugged off her presence hours earlier, now noticed the calm decisiveness in her posture, the measured cadence of her voice. For the first time, they understood she was in command. Not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it through competence, observation, and restraint. The intruders exchanged uncertain glances, their coordinated advance disrupted. They were experienced enough to recognize authority when it was genuine, even if it came silently. One faltered, reconsidering the path forward. Another checked the stairwell, hesitant to risk further exposure. The night nurse did not move toward them. She did not raise her voice or brandish any weapon. Her control was indirect but absolute. The very room responded to her guidance. Through the intercom, she gave subtle instructions, coordinating with the approaching Evac team. Her voice maintained calm, clipped precision, a low authority that carried far beyond the ward. The intruders, realizing that their entry had been entirely miscalculated, hesitated completely. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced by confusion and caution. By the time the helicopter landed and the extraction began, the night nurse had regained full control of the ward. Patients were secured, staff aligned without needing explicit orders, and the intruders were contained simply by her presence. She had revealed her authority without dramatics, without spectacle, yet it was unmistakable to those paying attention. And yet, in the aftermath, recognition was muted. The hospital had witnessed her competence, the intruders had feared it, but she returned to her routine as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The night nurse did not linger in the spotlight. Her authority had been asserted and earned, quietly, with restraint and precision, the hallmark of someone far more than the role anyone had assigned her. The ward's tension had shifted into a quiet, brittle stillness. The intruders no longer moved with purpose. Hesitation had replaced their confidence. They lingered near doorways and corridors, calculating, waiting, but the night nurse's presence filled the space with an invisible authority. Every subtle movement she made was a signal. She was aware of every step, every intention, every miscalculation they might make. The first intruder attempted to regroup, whispering to his companion, but she anticipated it. Without raising her voice, she shifted the cart closer to the intersection, subtly blocking the corridor, redirecting their path. The intruders stumbled, taken aback by the nurse's precise control of the environment. It was as if the ward itself obeyed her instructions, every door, every piece of equipment silently reinforcing her command. Staff followed her lead instinctively. The nurse gestured slightly, guiding nurses and doctors to safer positions near the patients. She checked vital monitors while maintaining a watchful eye on the intruders. Nothing was left to chance. She balanced restraint with decisive intervention, ensuring that no staff or patient was at risk, even as the intruder's agitation grew. From the stairwell, the evac team's approach could be heard, the faint hum of engines, the shuffle of boots on metal stairs. The night nurse maintained her calm stance, allowing the intruders to realize that the hospital was no longer a playground for their experiment in intimidation. The extraction had begun, but she remained in control, her presence alone keeping the intruders contained until backup fully arrived. One intruder made a desperate move toward the isolation bay. Her hand brushed a strategically placed sliding door panel, locking it electronically. He froze, realizing that every avenue had been anticipated. Another tried to flank via the supply corridor, but a quick adjustment of her body and the positioning of carts and trays created barriers that funneled him back toward the center. Finally, the response team entered. The intruders were caught in a corridor carefully managed by the nurses' quiet tactics. They surrendered quickly, not with force, but with the understanding that their misjudgment had cost them leverage. Patients were unharmed, staff were calm, and the ward had remained intact, entirely under her control. After the last intruder was escorted out, she walked through the ward, checking vitals, ensuring equipment was secure, and subtly adjusting monitors. Nothing looked out of place, nothing appeared extraordinary, yet every corner had been under her watchful eye, every patient had been protected, every misstep anticipated. No one clapped, no one cheered. Recognition was muted, almost non-existent. Yet the night nurse carried the weight of her actions silently, fully aware of the lives she had safeguarded and the authority she had quietly asserted. She had resolved the crisis with precision, restraint, and calm, without spectacle, without fanfare, without needing anyone to acknowledge her. The ward was quiet again. The storm had passed, and the night nurse, still in her pale blue scrubs, continued her rounds as if nothing had changed. Dawn crept over the hospital, pale light filtering through the blinds and casting long shadows across the polished floors. The ward was calm, almost eerily so, as if the night's chaos had been a distant dream. Monitors beeped softly, patients slept or stirred, and staff moved with a tentative, measured energy, aware that something extraordinary had occurred, though few could put it into words. The night nurse moved through the ward with the same deliberate care she had maintained all night. She checked beds, straightened sheets, adjusted monitors. No one spoke to her directly about the events hours before. The surgeons resumed their charts, the nurses returned to routine tasks. A faint nod here, a subtle glance there, hinted at recognition, but nothing overt. She did not seek it. Her work was not for applause. In the supply room, she returned the items she had moved earlier: clamps, emergency sheets, a portable monitor, all placed neatly as if nothing had been disturbed. Every motion was quiet and efficient, marking the space as orderly once again. There was no flourish, no dramatic statement, just precision. Staff who had witnessed the events were subdued. Some whispered briefly among themselves, cautious in their words. The intruders had been taken away, the evac team had secured the hospital, and yet the night nurse walked among them as if nothing had happened. The subtle authority she had wielded remained unspoken, almost invisible, yet it lingered in the air, an unacknowledged weight. She paused at room 14, checking a patient's IV line. The monitor beeped normally, vitals stable. Her hand lingered for a moment over the equipment, as if assuring herself that every detail had been maintained. The stress of the night was not visible on her face. Only the quiet line of her jaw suggested the mental toll of anticipation, calculation, and restraint. In the corridor, a young nurse glanced at her with hesitation. You handled it so well," the younger woman murmured. The night nurse's eyes met hers briefly. No words, just a small, almost imperceptible nod. The acknowledgement was private, subtle, a passing recognition of competence rather than an open declaration. By mid-morning, the ward had resumed its rhythm. Patients were stable, alarms had quieted, and routine tasks filled the hours. The night nurse moved through it all, a silent sentinel. She carried no triumph, no need for credit, only the quiet knowledge that her actions had preserved life, ensured safety, and maintained order in chaos. And in the quiet aftermath, the hospital continued, unchanged to the casual observer, yet subtly altered for those who had witnessed the night unfold. Authority had been asserted without spectacle. Competence had been displayed without fanfare, and the ward had survived intact. She paused once more at the nurse's station, glanced down a corridor, and adjusted the placement of a chair. Everything was as it should be. The night had ended, the ward was calm, and she remained unseen, uncelebrated, yet entirely indispensable. The sun rose fully over the hospital, spilling warm, pale light into the corridors. The once tense shadows of the night had vanished, leaving a sense of calm that almost felt fragile. The patients slept or stirred quietly, staff moved with measured routines, and the machines hummed their steady rhythms. To an outsider, the hospital seemed untouched by the events of the previous hours. The night nurse moved through the corridors, now emptying her mind of the tactical calculations that had guided her through the crisis. Her scrubs were slightly wrinkled, her hair loosely tied back, but her movements retained the same efficiency and precision as always. She checked monitors, adjusted beds, ensured everything was as it should be. Her presence was unobtrusive, almost invisible, just part of the natural rhythm of the hospital morning. A junior nurse paused near her, watching her with a mix of awe and confusion. I don't know how you handled everything last night," she said softly. The night nurse only offered a faint nod, a small, private acknowledgement, and continued her rounds. Recognition was fleeting, subtle, and not required. She had never needed it. Outside, the sound of the morning traffic began to creep into the hospital, but within the wards, a rare serenity remained. The night nurse paused at the window, looking at the city beyond, taking a breath. The weight of the previous night lingered, a quiet reminder of what had been prevented, not chaos, not harm, not death. And yet there was no fanfare, no applause, only the still, heavy satisfaction of work done well. She moved toward the supply room one last time, straightening trays and equipment, each item placed perfectly as if nothing had been disturbed. Her hands lingered over a medical kit, then she let them fall. The ward was safe. Patients were unharmed. Staff were unaware of how close disaster had come, and she allowed it to remain that way. Her walk back down the corridor was unhurried, every step deliberate, measured. There was no spotlight, no ceremony, no need for anyone to witness her competence. The authority she had quietly asserted remained her own, earned silently, carried alone. At the main exit, she paused, glanced once more at the hospital behind her, and stepped into the morning light. The city moved on, unaware of the night's events, unaware of the woman who had held a ward against chaos with nothing but precision, observation, and restraint. And as she disappeared into the dawn, the quiet truth remained. She had been underestimated, ignored, dismissed, but she had been exactly what the ward needed. The storm had passed, the patients were safe, and she had returned to her ordinary life, the extraordinary left unspoken, quietly owned. The ward was calm, the night nurse was gone, and the hospital continued intact because she had been there.